Dead man who rang the phone. From the day Nina Matveevna's youngest son died, an eternity of 5.5 years had passed. Those endless days contained the explosion of a dying star and the birth of a supernova. At the time, Nina stood by the coffin, convinced that life after was impossible, and everyone who was around felt sympathy for her, on the one hand, but on the other, was afraid of being caught in the crosshairs of her gaze. It was as if she could mark their own grief with her seal of approval. Her son's wife, Alia, came every day to weep on her shoulder. Together they looked at the pictures for the 100th time, in which the gradually growing boy smiled serenely and clearly, and had no idea that he would be only 31 years old when the doctors spread their hands over his body, prostrate on the surgical table. A year and a half later, Alia met another man. They met on the internet, and somehow everything came together quickly. At first, of course, there was distrust in her own happiness, then, and shame for him. But then it passed, and Alia established a new feeling, became stronger, and even began to speak with a new intonation. I have a right to be happy, as if someone was standing by to take that very right away at the right moment. Of course you have. I'm so happy for you, said Nina Matveevna, and when Ali left, she could not sleep for a long time. She felt both deeply offended and not entitled to be offended. Alia was only 26, with her whole life ahead of her. She could not spend her entire youth trying to feel the invisible presence of a dead man. And on the other hand, when in the first weeks after the funeral Alia called her in the middle of the night in tears and said, Nina Matveevna, I was asleep and someone was stroking my hair. I swear it was not dream. I felt his touch. It was him who came, wasn't it? When she said that, Nina suddenly felt so fulfilled and suddenly almost happy. Nothing was over. Her son continued to live. Just now he was given to communicate with his loved ones on such a subtle level that you tried to recognize. And she tried. She remembered every second that her boy was somewhere near, that he might be scared and bitter that his most loved ones had deemed him non-existent. For a while, her life became a quest to recognize the dead man's secret signs. Here the curtain in the kitchen fluttered, and the windows were closed. Here's a cat strangely staring into the void, and it looks as if it is watching someone. They say that animals have the gift of seeing the dead, and people once could, millennia ago, when they perceived themselves as one with nature. For Nina Matveevna, her son continued to be there, and Alia's willingness to accept this illusory presence was as if she were confirming him in reality. But 26 years old, plus a pretty face and a chiseled figure, of course, anyone would like that. 2 years later, Alia got married after all. Nina Matveevna was even invited to the wedding, but she didn't go, complaining of a migraine. Alia came home with a cake and some photographs, but Nina Matveevna turned her eyes away from her dress in white lace and her face, beaming with happiness and anticipation. Too strong were the memories of another wedding, at which Alia was just as radiant and just as dreamily looking into nothing, hoping for harbor and a hearth. Alia must have understood, and she called less and less often now, and then stopped, except on formal occasions, birthdays, New Year's. And then she had a child, a son, and she had no time for Nina with her grief and search for an otherworldly presence. And then 5.5 years passed, and it was October, a slushy evening, almost nighttime. Nina was sitting with a cup of cocoa on the couch, mousing over some book. She had always loved autumn. The bad weather seemed to give her the right to cut herself off from the rest of the world with plaid and tea, to feel like she was the only one, almost the center of the universe. It was a special, solemn kind of solitude. Suddenly the telephone rang. Nina Matveevna looked at her watch in surprise. 12:30. She had no acquaintances who allowed themselves to be called at midnight, unless their personal world was upside down. On the other hand, there were no people around Nina for whom she was number one in the address book, a number to call when a rescue was needed. Her eldest son and his family had lived in Canada for a long time. Even if the world ended there, they would call in the morning. Girlfriends scattered, they were dispersed by grief. Grief is the best guardian of loneliness. No one is interested in communicating with the moody. Alia called. Nina Matveevna did not even immediately recognize her excited voice. How nice that you're awake. I'm going crazy. Nina Matveevna, can you come over to my place now? I'll pay for the cab. What? Alia, what happened to you? Where are you? At home. Where else? My ex-sister-in-law sobbed. I would have come myself, but my son has a cold. He just fell asleep. Where's your husband? On a business trip until the end of the week. Nina Matveyevna, help me. I'm in such a state, I could go out of the window. All right, all right. Just give me the address. I'll be there in half an hour. No traffic. I'll be there in a jiffy. She did not even ask what happened. The voice of Ali she had not heard since 5.5 years ago, when the same night she told her that Sergei had had an accident. He was in intensive care. Nothing is clear and have to go. And just like that night, Nina hurriedly got ready in about 10 minutes. Dress, sweater, coat, shawl, mechanically wave a comb through her hair, and here she was already running down the street, and the wind was trying to snatch an old umbrella out of her hands. Near the subway at any time of the day, crowds of bambiliacs. Nina easily negotiated, though she must have been deceived, because she almost never used a cab and was not familiar with the prices. 40 minutes later, she was already ringing the doorbell, behind which Alia was waiting for her. Anina Matveyevna, how good of you to come. An excited Alia took her coat from her hands and dragged her into the kitchen, which smelled of comfort and arranged life. There was a plate of pancakes on the table. The windows were curtained with iron drapes, the floor glistened wetly, and a richly sprouted lemon tree bloomed in a ceramic pot on the refrigerator. It was immediately clear that those for whom hearth is not an empty word live here. What's wrong? Was your husband all right? Your son? Yes, yes. You'd better sit down. Nina Matveyevna, Sryasa called me. Nina went numb. Silently, she watched as her former daughter-in-law fidgeted mechanically, put the kettle on the stove, poured raspberries grated with sugar into a bowl, handed over the cups. Halia, is this a silly joke? If so, then, do I look like an idiot joker? Interrupted Alia. I myself thought that I would go crazy. A baby, but maybe you're mixed up. I still keep seeing Serge's voice everywhere. When I turn on the TV or the radio. And on the street, too, all the time. What about the voice? Said Alia annoyedly grimaced. The number I have identified. Number of his cell phone. Nina Mikhailovna. Is it true that you still pay for the number Sryasha? Nina looked down. It was silly and so childish, one of her secrets, the strangest secret, perhaps. She had told Alia about it back in the days when they had cried together over photo albums. It so happened that Nina Matveyevna helped her son's family solve all their domestic problems. She considered them young and headless, entitled to responsible, simple happiness. She came every month to take the meter readings, took the bills to the bank, if necessary. She herself dealt with the plumbers. She brought the documents to the housing department herself in order to privatize her son's apartment. Then I'll only help with my grandchildren, she said. But for now, enjoy your freedom. She also paid the cell phone bills of both spouses. And then Suryata was gone, and when the next second number came, Nina Matveyevna automatically, like an emotionless ghost, waddled to the office of the telephone company, and only when the smiling girl asked her for the number, Nina stumbled. The company even sat her on a chair and gave her a validol, so pale was her face. But after catching her breath, Nina suddenly made a decision: not now. If someone had asked her about her motives, she would not have been able to give a coherent answer, despite the fact that most of her life teaching geometry and algebra, and not by hearsay, knew with the logic. She smiled politely, called out the familiar numbers, and the phone account, no longer needed by her late son, received money. The next month, the same thing happened again, and then she got used to it. And just as others walked with a plastic tulip to a grave mound, trying to find some symbolic embodiment of the unspeakable, so she went to the phone company's office. Every month, on the second of the month, for 5.5 long years. And then one day, it was just last May, on Serge's birthday, Nina Matveyevna drank a 50-gram shot of vodka, lit a church candle by her son's photo, and then something occurred to her, and she dialed a number no one had used in years. And so her heart raced, almost jumped out of her chest when someone else's polite voice told her the predictable: the subscriber is out of network coverage. Those mechanical words filled Nina Matveyevna with a new meaning. Suryaja was out of range, out of action, out of comprehension, and, perhaps, even out of love. Foolishly, she had spent so many years trying to feel his presence, but he was out. Anina Matveevna, are you all right? A pale Alia sat opposite her on the rickety stool in the kitchen, with the still cold tea in front of her, which she had not even touched. I just thought if you do not pay for the number, it could pass to someone. Well, surely the unclaimed numbers are transferred to new subscribers. But even so, how did this new subscriber know my number? Why did he decide to make such a cruel joke? Alyosha, tell me in order. How'd it happen? And Nina tried to speak calmly. Alia told the story. It was the beginning of 11. Her son was feverish and capricious all evening, and finally he calmed down. She cautiously left the nursery, shutting the door behind her, when suddenly in the pocket of her robe the phone vibrated. Alia was not at all worried when her husband was away. They called often, including sometimes at night. But there was silence on the phone, and the silence seemed strange to her at once. No static on the line, no rustling, no breathing, one dissolving and as if pulling inside emptiness. In the end, Alia caught herself thinking that for a minute she had been standing dumbly in the corridor with the tube to her ear, listening, though no one was saying anything to her, as if she were hypnotized. And only then she guessed to look at the mobile screen, and her throat tightened. This number she knew by heart. It belonged to Sriyaja, her deceased first husband. Maybe Nina Matveevna decided to use this SIM card, Alia reassured herself. She dialed the number, but the answer was that the subscriber was unavailable. Somehow she calmed herself down, went to the shower, cooked some pancakes at once. Alia was the sort of person to be calmed by warm, greasy food. And then the phone rang again. This time she did not immediately pick up the phone. She stared mesmerized at the familiar numbers, probably for a minute and a half, and the whole time the phone didn't stop vibrating. A real person wouldn't have listened to that much beeping, she thought, and the next second it made her jump up and down, grabbing her heart. Alia got scared, really scared, and that's when she decided to call her former mother-in-law. Baby, it must have been a glitch on the line. Anina Matveevna was uncomfortable, but wanted to reassure Alia. It was so sorry for her, pale, crying, looking like a shadow of her former self. If you could only hear the silence, said Alia, staring at the wall. I've never experienced anything like it. It's as if eternity itself wants you to hear it. That's how you live, busy with your daily business, worrying about all kinds of shit, but you don't think about it, eternity. But it exists. It is smarter and older than you. It has seen millions of people like you. And sometimes it reminds somebody of itself, saying, do you think that you are the master of life here? But you're really nothing here. You came out of the dust, and you'll turn into it. Alia, honey, let me give you some according. Why did this happen when your husband isn't at home? You would have been more relaxed. Her ex-sister-in-law looked at her as a kindergarten teacher would look at a 5-year-old child who had only one ambition, not to sleep, who has grown up to become the owner of a factory or newspaper. That's not a nice look. Are you kidding me? He chose the hour on purpose. He wouldn't have called when her husband was around. Nina Matveevna left only in the morning. Alia categorically refused to let her go. Her sleep is becoming fragile in her old age, and when she is in somebody else's bed. She watched the shadows on the ceiling all night long. Her mind was restless. Nina Matveevna was not going to tell anyone, but it so happened that a week or two later her neighbor came over for coffee. The woman's name was Anthea, and people in the yard thought she was strange. For one thing, it was as if she had no age, that is, her yellowish face was riddled with wrinkles, but on the other hand the locals recalled that she looked exactly the same a quarter of a century ago. Secondly, she was always dressed alike, whether she wore a long black, nun-like cassock dress and a wool sweater, buttoned all the way up, whether it was hot or cold. Thirdly, she hardly ever spoke to anybody, could ignore a greeting addressed to her, but sometimes something came over her, and she rang at somebody's door and indifferently gave way to the owners, who were frightened by the very fact of her appearance. You had better buy a place in the cemetery, for a dead man in your family is expected soon. Or, lock up your daughter. She will soon meet a gangster, fall in love with him, and he ruin her whole life. will wait years from the zone. Everything Anthissa announced came true, and the deceased happened in a family where there were no old people and no one was sick. And the daughter of quiet philologists punctured the tire of her bicycle just opposite the bench on which sat a company of tough, tattooed guys. One of them came over to help, and word for word they all before the new year, when the young wife was already expecting her firstborn, he was arrested for armed robbery. And when Anthissa was asked, "Tell me what will happen," and even offered a lot of money, she just shrugged and went away silently. And so Nina Matveevna was going for a week, but in the end she came up to her in the yard, grabbed her sleeve, almost fell on her knees, and told her everything in a hurry. She had no hope for anything. Her appeal was more like the convulsions of a drowning man than a well thought out rescue plan. But a miracle happened. Anthissa squeezed her hand and said, "Make coffee by midnight. I'll come in and talk." By the way, she did not drink the coffee, though she twirled the cooling already had a wedding in autumn, and a few days cup in her hands with obvious pleasure and covered her eyes, breathing in the fragrant steam with her nose. Nina Matveevna sat opposite and did not dare move, afraid to offend or frighten her strange neighbor. She baked an apple pie on purpose, but it remained on the table untouched. "It happens," Anthissa said, listening to a confused story. "They come for their own, invite them in. Before, there were no phones, they just came by. In their sleep mostly. Who pays attention to dreams nowadays? My husband used to call me. He's been gone for 35 years. And when I was in a bad mood or sick, he'd call. And back then, no cell phones, no caller ID. I had an ordinary plastic phone with a disc, just like everyone else. But I knew right away it was ringing. Your sister-in-law's description of silence was right. It is exactly like that, calling. But you can't listen to it for long, or else the dead man will make a choice for you. He will drag you away. If you do not have the habit of eternity, it will quickly consume you. What is there to do?" And Nina Matveevna was frightened for Alia. Does that mean that she might die? But she has a family, a small child, and anyway, don't be mad, Danthus shrugged. Why are you all like children? You should talk about death with you. You just tell her not to listen if she calls again. It's not for you, but for her to decide whether to go to the call or stay here. I decided to stay for now, although sometimes I think that maybe I should. Alia told Nina Matveevna several times later that there were other calls. Once when she broke her leg in the ice and there was nobody to help her. She hopped around the house on crutches and ate painkillers like candy. She felt very sorry for herself. Then all the family would go to bed, and she would lock herself in the bathroom, with her leg in a cast hanging down, wash herself, and then she would sit under the stream of water and cry. Self-pity is probably the fastest growing feeling in the world. Like a nuclear mushroom, it transforms before your eyes, and then it kills all life around it, because it quickly turns into a complaint about others. That's when the bell rang. But Alia remembered what she had been told by her former mother-in-law, though she did not quite believe her, and in a few seconds she blacked out. And then there was another call, years later, when her son went to school. He had grown into a difficult child, and one day he had snapped at Alice so much that she had to run away to the bathroom, because it was not pedagogical to cry in front of children. And again there was a call, and again on the screen was the number of Sriasha, the dead man. And then either he disappeared completely, or Alia was too distant from Nina Matveevna to share her secrets with her, and she was a deaf old woman who found it difficult to talk on the phone.